The date is April 30th, 1975. The city of Saigon burns beneath a sky choked with smoke and helicopter exhaust. On the embassy roof, American Marines shove panicked Vietnamese civilians away from the last departing aircraft, while below, North Vietnamese tanks smash through the wrought iron gates of the presidential palace. The longest war in American history ends not with a treaty signing, but with the desperate whomp 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 of rotors fading over a conquered city. It took 30 years for that moment to arrive. 30 years of jungle fighting, of political intrigue, of bodies piled in rice paddies and tunnels. The cost was staggering: 58,000 American dead, 1 million Vietnamese, 3 million across all of Indochina. And the strange truth is, the very first weapons the Allies captured in that long struggle were not rifles or machine guns. They were bows and arrows. So how did a guerrilla army armed with medieval weapons force the most advanced military power on Earth to flee from a rooftop in Saigon? The answer begins in October 1945, in a place called Cochin, China, the southern region of Vietnam. There, British and Gurkha troops landed with orders that seemed straightforward: disarm the Japanese soldiers who had surrendered a month earlier, and hold the country until the French returned. Nothing about that mission would prove straightforward. The men of the 1st Battalion, 1st Gurkha Rifles, came ashore near Saigon with the atomic explosions of Hiroshima and Nagasaki still ringing in their ears. They expected a defeated enemy, a peaceful occupation. Instead, they found a country in chaos. The Viet Minh, a nationalist front led by the communist Ho Chi Minh, had declared independence and were actively resisting any return of French colonial rule. The first weapons the Gurkhas confiscated from these fighters were not firearms but bows and arrows. A young intelligence officer named John Cross watched this with growing unease. He was just 20 years old, with less than a year of commissioned service, but he understood that something new was happening. The enemy they faced did not fight in open formations or hold ground. They melted into the population, struck from ambush, and vanished into the jungle. The British had come to disarm the Japanese, but they found themselves caught between a defeated empire and a revolution. The situation was impossible with the forces available. The British did not have enough troops to keep the Viet Minh at arm's length while simultaneously disarming the Japanese. So 2 Japanese battalions, men who had been the enemy just weeks before, were rearmed and placed under British command. The Yamagishi and Takahashi battalions reported to Lieutenant Colonel C.E. Jarvis, Cross's commanding officer. Every day, the Japanese commander had to come in and update them on his patrols. One morning, the Japanese commander arrived with news that stopped the briefing cold. They had captured a man they believed to be a Soviet agent. When asked how they knew he was Russian, the Japanese officer answered with quiet certainty: because of his uniform, and because he was carrying a jar of roasted coffee beans. In a country where coffee was scarce and the troops drank tea, that jar marked him as a foreigner. The next day, the Russian agent stood before the British officers. He was stocky and red-haired, wearing khaki drill with a yellow hammer and sickle emblem sewn on each lapel, and a matching badge stuck into his forage cap. Clutched to his chest was a large glass jar full of roasted coffee beans. He was a living symbol of the global reach of the communist movement, proof that the struggle in Vietnam was not a local rebellion but a proxy war with international sponsors. John Cross watched the interrogation carefully. The Russian said nothing useful. He was bundled onto the next convoy heading south to Saigon and was never heard from again. But the message was clear. The Soviets were already meddling in Southeast Asia, even as the Second World War was still winding down. The fight for Vietnam was not just about nationalism. It was part of a larger global struggle. Years later, working in a university in Kathmandu, Cross would hear Soviet officials openly boast about their early involvement in the region. The jar of coffee beans had been a warning. The West had received intelligence about Soviet penetration, but few seemed to understand what it meant. The communists were playing a long game, and they had already begun their work while the Allies were still celebrating victory in Europe. But the jolt of the Soviet capture soon faded into the background of daily operations. Cross had more immediate concerns. He was put in command of one of the Japanese battalions, the Yamagishi Butai, for a search operation against the Viet Minh. The orders were simple: move into a heavily wooded area and clear out any resistance. For a young officer who had never led men in combat, it was a daunting assignment. The patrol moved cautiously through rough, thickly wooded country. The Japanese soldiers moved with discipline, scanning the jungle for any sign of the enemy. They had gone perhaps 2 hours when the first shots cracked out. A Viet Minh ambush. The main body of attackers melted away into the trees, leaving behind 2 wounded men, one of them a youth armed with a catapult. While a Japanese medic examined the wounded, Cross noticed his soldiers gesturing wildly from a small bank nearby. They were pointing at something on the ground. The interpreter, after a quick conversation, turned to Cross with a serious expression. The soldiers were afraid, he said. They had seen a hand. When Cross demanded they pull it, they hesitated. Finally, one brave soldier grasped the hand, with 2 others holding onto his waist. They pulled out a small, stark-naked man, clutching a brand-new machine gun of a design Cross had never seen. The man looked up at the cloudless sky and went berserk, shrieking and struggling to escape. He had been hiding in a leaf-covered ditch, buried, and waiting for a signal to open fire on the patrol. But before he could spring his ambush, the Japanese soldiers had urinated into the ditch, not knowing he was there. Thinking the wetness was rain, the hidden gunman had raised his hand to feel for precipitation. That single, unconscious gesture had given him away. He had been ready to cut down the entire patrol with a burst of automatic fire. But his own impatience and a biological accident had betrayed him. Cross never forgot that lesson. In jungle warfare, the smallest detail could mean the difference between life and death. The hidden man was captured, along with his weapon. Cross would later use this story to teach Vietnamese officers at the British Jungle Warfare School. The lesson was simple. Constant vigilance was non-negotiable. And secret weapons did not have to be modern or sophisticated to be deadly. A man with a machine gun, lying still in a muddy ditch, could kill a dozen soldiers before anyone knew he was there. The British remained in Cochin China for 3 months. When they finally handed over responsibility to the returning French, the situation was already deteriorating. The Viet Minh had grown bolder, and the French had no understanding of the enemy they faced. Within days of taking over, the French suffered more casualties in a single skirmish than the British had taken in their entire deployment. John Cross knew, even then, that the French were doomed. The war that began with bows and arrows and a jar of coffee would eventually consume 3 nations, topple governments, and tear America apart. But in 1945, none of that was visible. The jungle was quiet, the enemy invisible, and the lessons were still being learned. For John Cross, the education had just begun. The next time he heard that jar of coffee mentioned, it would be decades later, when a Soviet official in Kathmandu boasted about how early his country had infiltrated Southeast Asia. The warning had been there all along. The West simply had not listened. The year is 1948. Malaya, 3 years after the bows and arrows of Cochin China, a new war is beginning. The Malayan Communist Party has declared open rebellion against British rule, and the jungle that once hid Japanese soldiers now hides a different enemy. The British call them communist terrorists, or CTs. They call themselves freedom fighters. A young officer named John Cross has just arrived in this new theatre of war. Cross had seen the Viet Minh in action. He had watched the French stumble into disaster. Now he was in Malaya with a platoon of the 1st Battalion, 7th Gurkha Rifles, stationed in the state of Negri Sembilan. The orders were straightforward. Go to the village of Sepang, show the flag, find the guerrillas. In practice, these 2 goals were nearly impossible to reconcile. Show yourself, and the enemy hides. Try to hide, and you cannot reassure the frightened planters and their families. Sepang was a typical rubber estate village. Coconut palms, a few Chinese shops, a police station staffed by Malays, and 1 Chinese interpreter. Beyond the village, the country opened into a patchwork of tapioca plots, vegetable gardens, and tangled scrub where Chinese squatters lived in makeshift huts. Beyond that, the primary jungle began, dark and sealed under a continuous canopy. It was here that the guerrillas of a local gang operated, controlled by 3 men known only as the Killer, the Extortioner, and the Drill Master. Cross and his 20 Gurkhas patrolled the area for days without a single contact. Then they heard a bugle call. Then the sound of range firing, the unmistakable crack of rifles being zeroed. The guerrillas were training. Cross reported the find, and his stay was extended. The following day, his patrol discovered a hidden sack containing a large tin crammed with documents. There were weapon training pamphlets, histories of communism with pictures of Karl Marx, and columns of money figures. It was proof they were in the heart of the gang's territory. Near the top of a hillock, Cross found an empty hut. Inside, a kettle was still simmering on the hob. There was an alarm device rigged outside, a few army blankets, and a wooden bugle. That wooden bugle was the drill master's tool, a wooden instrument used to summon his men for training. Cross picked it up. He weighed it in his hands. It was crude, handmade, but effective. He would later learn that his own attempts to signal his men by imitating a cuckoo call had alerted the guerrillas instead. There are no cuckoos in Malaya. The lesson in junglecraft was harsh and immediate. By early 1949, the British military command realized they needed specialized units to operate in the deep jungle. The result was a scratch force called Force Ferret. It drew its men from various sources: civilian Europeans who knew the country, British soldiers, Gurkha riflemen, Malay troops, and Chinese liaison officers. But most importantly, it recruited Dayak and Iban trackers from Sarawak, men whose understanding of the jungle was instinctive, not learned. One of the Gurkhas who joined Force Ferret was a young rifleman of the 1st Battalion, 2nd Gurkha Rifles. He remembered the experience with vivid clarity. A pre-war British colonel had been recalled to lead the unit. There was a very tall planter who knew the area, moved at great speed through the undergrowth, and never wore footwear. The unit was split into 4 sections, each operating independently, searching for guerrilla base camps deep in the jungle. Force Ferret achieved what no conventional patrol had managed. In its short existence, it discovered 12 permanent guerrilla camps. Each camp was well sited, cleverly hidden, and carefully guarded. These were not temporary bivouacs. They were fortified bases with defensive positions, cooking facilities, and sleeping quarters. The guerrillas had built a network of strongholds across the country, and Force Ferret had proven that with the right skills and the right men, these camps could be found. But Force Ferret had a dark side. It was under strength, which made it expensive in manpower. Its European members carried a casual contempt for military discipline that infuriated its commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel W.C. Walker. They had a jaundiced view of the British military's capabilities, believing their own local knowledge superior. The slackness in basic military procedure was so pronounced that Walker became highly dissatisfied. The unit was soon disbanded. Walker was given a new task. He was ordered to establish a proper jungle warfare training school, later known as the Jungle Warfare School. The lesson of Force Ferret was clear: ad hoc units could show what was possible, but only systematic training could produce the results needed for a long campaign. The school would teach tracking, navigation, silent movement, and ambush techniques. It would produce soldiers who could operate in the guerrillas' own environment and beat them at their own game. In July 1949, an incident occurred that revealed the grim realities of this war. A Gurkha corporal from the 1st Battalion, 6th Gurkha Rifles, was operating in deep jungle in northern Malaya. His patrol captured a guerrilla. The corporal made a decision that would cause a scandal. He decapitated the dead man. Thinking that a single head was not enough to establish identity, he also cut off both hands. The corporal returned to the state capital, a lost star. He went to the police station, but it was a holiday, and the building was empty. He was directed to the home of the man who would have to deal with the evidence, a local police officer. It was 3 in the afternoon. The officer and his wife were having a siesta. The corporal handed over his package. The officer, realizing the head and hands needed to be photographed, drove off to find the official photographer, having no telephone in those days. Before leaving, Carbonell placed the package in the refrigerator. He did not wake his wife. While he was gone, his wife woke up, went downstairs for a cold drink, and opened the refrigerator door. She saw the severed head and hands. She fell into a dead faint. When Carbonell returned, he found her unconscious. He carried her upstairs, removed the grisly evidence, and disposed of it. When his wife came to and told him what she had seen, he assured her she had experienced a nightmare. There was nothing in the refrigerator. She believed him. The murder charges against the corporal were dropped. The incident was hushed up, but it illustrated a fundamental truth about this type of warfare. The emotional and psychological pressures on soldiers operating in the jungle were immense. They were fighting an enemy they could not see, in a terrain that favored the hidden and the patient. Conventional rules of engagement sometimes seemed absurd in this context. The war in Malaya was a war of ambush, attrition, and fear. 2 years into the emergency, the situation remained in the balance. Guerrillas were being eliminated at a rate that outnumbered their recruitment, but the police were losing men faster than the guerrillas were. Over 100 civilians were being killed every month, often by torture. The realization that coordinated planning was essential led to the formation of war executive committees at state and district levels. For the first time, the administration, police and military were working together in a unified structure, January 22, 1951. The most successful contact of the entire Malayan emergency occurred not because of brilliant planning, but because of a mistake. A major from the 1st Battalion, 2nd Gurkha Rifles, received a message reporting the location of a guerrilla company in the state of Johor. He was roused from a deep sleep. The telephone line was bad. He misheard the coordinates. His B company went to the wrong place. Richardson took 2 platoons, commanded by corporals, as there was a chronic shortage of senior ranks in all Gurkha battalions. He advanced in the center with a platoon on each flank. The ground was not deep jungle. It was a patchwork of rubber plantations, swamp, and paddy fields, with visibility severely restricted by ground mist. They met the guerrillas by accident. The two sides saw each other at close range and fire was exchanged. The Gurkhas killed 4 guerrillas in the initial volley. The enemy tried to break contact, but the company sergeant major executed a deft flanking movement that cut off their escape. The mist lifted, revealing the guerrillas trapped in an area of swamp between the 2 platoons. The slaughter was swift and bloody. When the firing stopped, 12 bodies were recovered from the killing ground. With weapons, the ground was swampy, so other bodies may have remained hidden. Months later, the true toll emerged. 35 guerrillas had been killed or mortally wounded in that single contact. Among the dead was the commander of the entire 7th Company of the Malayan Races Liberation Army. Richardson's misheard radio message had sent his company to a location he never intended to reach. The guerrillas were there anyway. It was the kind of luck that cannot be planned, only seized. But it also proved a critical point. Aggressive patrolling, even in error, produced results. The success at Johor was a morale booster for the security forces, but it did not change the fundamental nature of the war. The guerrillas remained elusive. They controlled the initiative. They chose when and where to strike. The British knew they needed a new approach, a shift from purely military operations to a broader strategy that would isolate the guerrillas from their support base among the civilian population. That shift was coming, but it had not yet arrived in 1951. Later that year came a stark reminder of the cost of failing to adapt to jungle conditions. A platoon of the Queen's Own Royal West Kent Regiment was operating on a rubber estate. They adopted a night-stop position that they had learned in Germany, a conventional European deployment. The position was on a rubber estate, not in the jungle proper, but the enemy had been watching. The guerrillas knew that the troops were using a routine that made them predictable. The ambush was devastating. The company commander was killed immediately. 3 soldiers standing in an open vehicle were shot dead. The scout car's guns jammed. The situation was desperate. Only the bravery of 2 soldiers, a lance corporal and a private, prevented a complete rout. They stood their ground and returned fire, buying time for the survivors to seek cover. But the cost was terrible. 11 men of the battalion and 3 IBAN trackers were dead. 5 soldiers were badly wounded. The guerrillas lost 4 men. The West Kent ambush exposed a critical failure in training and doctrine. The battalion had been operating with a Second World War mindset. They thought in terms of front lines and hot war, not guerrilla warfare and jungle craft. Their company commanders had relied on tactics that worked against the Japanese in Burma, but this was a different enemy in a different war. The guerrillas had observed the battalion's predictable routines and struck at the moment of greatest vulnerability. The lessons were simple, brutal, and clear. Rubber estates are not open country. They are extensions of the jungle, with lines of sight limited to a few yards. Night-stop positions must be varied, concealed, and protected by sentries who understand the terrain. A routine is a death sentence. The guerrillas did not need to be smarter or better armed. They only needed the security forces to make mistakes, and in 1951, the British were still making plenty. By the end of 1951, the Malayan emergency had reached a critical juncture. The guerrillas were not winning, but they were not losing either. The British had learned some hard lessons, but a comprehensive strategy was still lacking. The man who would provide that strategy had not yet arrived. His name was General Gerald Templer. and he was about to be sent to Malaya with extraordinary powers. The war was about to enter a new phase, one that would test the patience and resilience of both sides. The jungle, as always, was patient. It could wait. 1952. The Malayan emergency was now entering its fourth year. General Templer had arrived with a simple message. This war would be won in the hearts and minds of the people. But the jungle itself remained a stubborn, dangerous place where a single mistake could mean death. Major Cross was commanding a company of the 1st Battalion, 7th Gurkha Rifles, operating out of Negri Sembilan. His area of responsibility had just been extended northward, up to a dotted line on the map that marked a state boundary. He asked 3 times whether the company to his north had been notified of the change. 3 times he was told yes. Something told him otherwise. Cross took a patrol of 4 men and moved on a bearing of 10 degrees, away from the patrols on either flank. They came across a large guerrilla camp, empty but well built, with strong defensive positions and primitive facilities for repairing weapons. Cross pushed on. At the top of a small rise, they heard a noise on the far side of an overgrown swamp. Cross thought it was man-made. The Gurkhas thought it was a bird. A short while later, they heard it again. Definitely man-made. Cross decided to cross the swamp and investigate. It was about 30 yards wide, ankle-deep and thick with aloes that made a metallic noise when brushed against. Halfway across, they heard the unmistakable clink of a water bottle lid. Then voices. Men were coming toward them through the gloom. Cross and his men froze, raised their weapons and took aim. 1, 2, 3 men came into sight at a dozen yards, dressed like soldiers, but with a red emblem in their hats. 7, 8 men. Cross tensed to give the order to fire. Then the man on his right hissed a warning. Do not shoot. It was Sergeant Indra Bahadur Rai, and he had recognized the man leading the other patrol. It was his cousin brother, a sergeant in the 2nd Battalion, 7th Gurkha Rifles. Cross lowered his weapon, took off his hat, and stepped forward. The other patrol had been wearing a different recognition sign on their hats. One Cross had not been briefed on. The order about the boundary change had never been given. 2 companies had been operating in overlapping areas, each believing anyone they met had to be the enemy. Cross later asked Rai why he had urged him not to open fire. The answer was devastating. Because I recognized my cousin brother. 45 years later, when the 2 men met again in the eastern hills of Nepal, Rai remembered the moment with perfect clarity. He described how Cross had stepped forward, shouting in Nepali not to shoot. The troops to the north had never been told their boundary had changed. It was very lucky, Rai said, that they had not had a severe firefight. 2 weeks earlier, soldiers of the Queen's Royal Regiment had shot each other in a similar confusion, killing 6 men. 1953, food denial had become a constant feature of operations. The guerrillas had been forced deeper into the jungle, where they grew their own crops to survive. The security forces had to find and destroy these cultivations. In August of that year, Operation Boxer was launched. For the first time ever, an entire battalion was flown into deep jungle landing sites by helicopter. It saved days of exhausting approach marches and left more time for the actual operation. Cross had a problem: how to destroy the cultivations without chemicals. Burning only produced wood ash that fertilized the soil. Uprooting crops was tedious but effective, though it also helped keep the ground weeded. The night before the first airdrop, Cross had a dream. He dreamed the scheduled drop contained no rice. In the morning he laughingly told his platoon commanders, who stoutly defended the commissariat. Such a thing could never happen, they said. But it did. The airdrop arrived with no rice at all. Instead, it contained 2 packs marked African rations full of bully beef, which no self-respecting Hindu would touch. The sugar had been mixed with the salt. Cross had to call for 2 Auster flights to resupply his company with proper rations. The first supplementary drop was supposed to fix the problem. The pilot saw smoke curling up through the trees and dropped his load there, assuming it was Cross's position. His map showed Cross 10 miles farther north, but he did not check it. 2 hours later, the pilot returned with the second load. This time, he could not raise any smoke from the first location, so he flew north and found the real dropping zone. As he circled overhead, he radioed Cross. "Here is the rest of your rice." Cross answered that they had not received any rice yet. The pilot then realized his mistake. He had dropped the first 2 sacks of rice on the guerrilla camp, so much for food denial. The rice that was meant to starve the enemy had instead fed them. The incident became a lesson at the jungle warfare school. Pilots were thereafter instructed to carry the larger-scale maps used by the infantry. Map reading procedures were tightened. But the deeper lesson was harder to learn. In jungle warfare, even the best-laid plans could unravel from a single small error. Cross's company had to be resupplied from scratch, losing 3 days of operational time. The guerrillas, meanwhile, had enjoyed an unexpected feast of British rice, 1954. The long-term infiltration of the guerrilla movement was one of the most delicate and dangerous operations Special Branch ever attempted. One police agent had risen to become propaganda-cum-political advisor on a regional committee. He had spent years building trust, shaping plans, and feeding information back to his handlers. Now the moment had come to strike. The plan was to lure the entire committee into an ambush at a deserted estate manager's bungalow, where they would collect supplies. 32 guerrillas were expected. The ambush was set for a carefully chosen night. One company of Gurkhas crawled into position, armed with enough firepower to ensure that no one could escape. The agent and the guide who was bringing the guerrilla foraging party to the collection point were the only 2 men who would be wearing white shirts. There would be plenty of time, because the food had to be broken down into man-loads before it could be carried away. Cross's company had a special task. They would pursue any survivors and attack the camp the guerrillas had come from, where another 40 men were believed to be hiding, including 7 wounded. Cross had to take along a police inspector, a photographer from the Malay film unit, 2 Aboriginal trackers, a British dog handler, and his dog. The photographer had just returned from his honeymoon and was in no condition for jungle operations. Cross felt sorry for him. Before midnight, Cross heard firing in the distance. He moved his men to the ambush site and learned what had gone wrong. At the last moment, the guerrilla military commander had decided not to send all his men for the food lift. Half stayed behind. Worse, the guerrillas had been given white sacks to carry the food. In the dark, a man carrying a large white sack on his back looked exactly like a man wearing a white shirt. The ambush had been designed to wait until the agent signaled he was safe. But he had been given an unexpected escort that had to be dealt with first. By the time he could signal, the situation had unraveled. Only 1 guerrilla was killed. 1 more was captured, wounded. The rest escaped into the darkness. Cross took the agent and his party into the rubber estate, trying to track the survivors back to their camp. But the agent did not know where he was. The communist hierarchy deliberately kept their underlings ignorant of local geography, precisely to prevent defections. Cross searched for days but never found the main camp. After a week of thrashing through the jungle, he dispersed his men and returned to base. The operation had been a bitter disappointment, and it showed how easily a well-laid plan could be undone by a last-minute detail. 1955, the political landscape was shifting. The British government had promised Malaya independence once the communist threat was seen to have abated. As a first step, elections were held for an executive council. The newly formed Alliance Party won, and its leader, Tunku Abdul Rahman, became chief minister. To start the independence process, the government declared an amnesty for all guerrillas who had committed offences before a certain date. Millions of leaflets were dropped over the jungle. Voice aircraft flew overhead, broadcasting the amnesty conditions in Chinese dialects. The leaflets showed strip cartoons of a returning prodigal son being embraced by his father. The propaganda was well-intentioned but clumsy. The scenes depicted European ideals of forgiveness that had little resonance in Chinese culture. No Chinese father would express such joy in public. The leaflets must have seemed strange and foreign to the men hiding in the jungle. In December of that year, peace talks were held at Bailing, a small town in the north of the country. Chief Minister Tunku Abdul Rahman met face-to-face with Chin Peng, the Secretary-General of the Malayan Communist Party. The talks were the last chance for a political settlement. Chin Peng demanded recognition of the Communist Party and a ceasefire. Rahman offered only surrender. The 2 sides could not bridge the gap. The talks collapsed. The communists saw the amnesty for what it was, a golden opportunity to rebuild their supplies and strengthen their positions. In Johor, they launched a renewed offensive. Exactly the same pattern would later be seen in Vietnam, when bombing pauses allowed the communists to regain lost ground. The failure at Bailing meant the war would continue. Troops were rushed to areas where the guerrillas had grown stronger during the months of negotiation. Cross and his men were among those redeployed. They were suddenly ordered over 100 miles from their base to an area near the village of Simpang Patang. A high-level communist meeting was scheduled to take place there, including the deputy commander of the Malayan Communist Party. Troops were sent in to surround the area. 3 weeks into the operation, it was decided to bomb the suspected hideouts. Warning was given by Radio Malaya. The guerrillas naturally moved away. The bombing produced no results. Cross's company found only 3 dead monkeys and a dead pig. 1956. The war had entered its 8th year, and the guerrillas were becoming harder and harder to find. The statistic that haunted every commander was this: it took 1,000,000 man-hours of combined effort for a 20-second contact. For every minute of combat, there were weeks of patient, silent waiting. The ambush had become the most important weapon in the security forces' arsenal, but it required a kind of patience that most soldiers found almost unbearable. One company of the 2nd Battalion, 2nd Gurkha Rifles, had set up an ambush in a swamp. Special Branch had provided specific information. 3 guerrillas would come down a track at some point. The Gurkhas took their positions in the mud and waited. The days passed. The water soaked through their uniforms. Leeches found their way into every opening. The men grew tired, hungry, and cold. The constant dampness began to affect their health. After 25 days, the commanding officer made a decision. The men had passed the point of endurance. They were no longer efficient. He gave the order to pack up and prepare to withdraw. The ambush would be abandoned. The men began to gather their equipment, ready to leave the swamp that had been their home for nearly a month. On the very next day, before the withdrawal could begin, 3 guerrillas walked along the track. They moved casually, unaware that they were being watched. The Gurkhas, still in position, waited for the signal. The guerrillas entered the killing ground. Fire was opened at close range. All 3 were killed within seconds. The ambush that had seemed like a failure for 25 days had succeeded on the 26th. The Gurkhas were allowed to return to their base that same day. They had proven something that every jungle fighter knew but that commanders often forgot. Patience was not just a virtue, it was a weapon. The guerrillas had been patient for years, waiting for the British to tire of the war, but the Gurkhas had shown that they could be patient too. The ambush had cost 25 days of discomfort. It had yielded 3 dead enemies, and a lesson that no training manual could fully teach. In the jungle, survival belonged to those who could wait. The French war in Indochina was barely 2 years old when the year 1948 began. There was no front line, no stable boundary between friend and enemy. The Viet Minh moved through the jungle like water through sand, appearing where they were least expected and vanishing before a counter-strike could form. French commanders still thought in terms of forts and road networks, but the enemy thought in terms of villages and rice bowls. The gap between these 2 ways of war would only widen with time. The French had never understood the nature of the fight they were in. They treated the war as a colonial police action, a matter of restoring order among unruly subjects. But the Vietnamese were not fighting for better administration. They were fighting for the end of foreign rule entirely, and they had found an ideology that gave their resistance global meaning. Communism gave them discipline, a chain of command that stretched from the village cell to Moscow, and a patience that European armies simply could not match. In 1949, the situation became strategically hopeless for the French. Mao Zedong's communists won control of China, and overnight the Viet Minh gained a sanctuary across the northern border. French generals understood what this meant. The enemy could now train its soldiers in safety, stockpile weapons beyond reach, and plan offensives without fear of pursuit. The French tried to seal the border with a chain of forts along the frontier, but the forts were isolated, undersupplied, and surrounded by jungle that the Viet Minh owned. General Vo Nguyen Giap had studied Napoleon carefully. He understood that the war would pass through distinct phases. The first was consolidation, training his forces in the sanctuary of China. The second was harassment, keeping the French off balance with raids and ambushes. The third would be open battle, when his army was strong enough to destroy French formations in the field. In 1951, Giap attempted that third phase too early. He threw his divisions against French forts in the Red River Delta and was beaten back 3 times with heavy losses. The French believed they had won a decisive victory. They had not. Giap retreated into the jungle, studied his mistakes, and waited. He had learned that the French could not hold ground without roads, and that their supply lines were vulnerable wherever the forest pressed close against the road. He also understood that the French public had no appetite for a long war. Every casualty reported in Paris eroded the political will to continue. The Viet Minh could absorb losses that would break a European army because their soldiers believed in a cause greater than themselves. The French, by contrast, fought without a cause that any Vietnamese could share. They spoke of defending the free world against communism, but the Vietnamese saw only the same colonial masters who had ruled them for decades. French officers rarely learned the local languages. French administrators treated the population as subjects, not citizens. The Vietnamese had a word for this. It was the same word they had used for the Chinese occupiers centuries before. The French never understood that they were not fighting a war against an army. They were fighting a war against a people. By 1953, the French command made a fatal decision. They would force Giap into a set-piece battle at a remote garrison called Dien Bien Phu, deep in the mountainous jungle near the Laotian border. The plan was to build a fortified airhead, draw the Viet Minh into attacking it, and then destroy them with artillery and air power. The French believed that the jungle would prevent Giap from bringing heavy guns into position. They were catastrophically wrong. The Viet Minh moved artillery pieces up the mountainsides by hand. Tens of thousands of porters dragged disassembled howitzers along trails that French intelligence had dismissed as impassable. The guns were placed in reverse slope positions on the jungle-covered heights overlooking the French positions. When the siege began in March 1954, French artillery could not reply effectively. The Viet Minh gunners fired down into the garrison from concealed positions that could not be spotted from the ground or the air. The garrison held out for 56 days. The Viet Minh dug trenches that crept forward night by night, circling the French positions like a tightening noose. The airstrip was knocked out in the first week, and all supplies had to be parachuted in. The monsoon rains turned the battlefield into a sea of mud. The French Foreign Legion, the paratroopers, the colonial infantry, all fought with extraordinary courage, but courage could not compensate for logistics. By early May, the garrison was running out of ammunition, food, and hope. On May 7, 1954, the French commander ordered a ceasefire. The siege was over. More than 10,000 French soldiers marched into captivity. Dien Bien Phu was not just a military defeat. It was the moment that ended French Indochina. The Geneva Conference was already underway, and the fall of the garrison handed the Viet Minh an unassailable negotiating position. France would withdraw from the entire peninsula within the year. The war that had begun with bows and arrows in 1945 had ended with the complete humiliation of a European power. The Geneva Accords divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel, creating a communist north and a non-communist south. It was a temporary arrangement intended to last 2 years until elections could reunify the country. But neither side trusted the other, and the United States, already deeply alarmed by the spread of communism in Asia, moved to fill the vacuum left by the French. American advisors began arriving in South Vietnam almost immediately. The template for the next 20 years of war was being set. The North Vietnamese did not waste time. They established the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a network of jungle paths and mountain passes that ran through Laos and Cambodia, bypassing the demilitarized zone. It was a logistical artery that would allow the North to supply the Viet Cong insurgency in the South. The trail was not a road in the conventional sense. It was a flowing system, constantly repaired, rerouted, and hidden under triple canopy jungle. American bombers would pound it for years and never close it. The sanctuary that the French had been unable to deny was now larger and more resilient than ever. In October 1963, John Cross, now a major, visited South Vietnam. The British Army had been running courses for the Army of the Republic of Vietnam at the Jungle Warfare School in Malaya, and Cross wanted to see how the American and South Vietnamese forces were adapting to the jungle. What he found troubled him deeply. The Americans had vast resources, helicopters, gunships, electronic sensors, but they did not seem to understand the nature of the enemy they were fighting. Cross observed training at American Special Forces camps and at the RVN Ranger School. He saw instructors teaching soldiers to fight a conventional war of firebases and search-and-destroy operations. The emphasis was on firepower, on killing the enemy from a distance with artillery and airstrikes. But the Viet Cong did not stand and fight. They melted into the jungle when the Americans came, and they returned when the Americans left. The Americans were fighting for ground. The Viet Cong were fighting for the allegiance of the people. The contrast with the British approach in Malaya was stark. In Malaya, food denial, intelligence integration, and political reform had been the main pillars of the campaign. The British had understood that you could not shoot your way to victory. The Americans, by contrast, seemed to believe that superior technology would eventually overwhelm the enemy. Cross noted that the South Vietnamese army was trained to fight a war that the Viet Cong had no intention of fighting. The gap between American doctrine and jungle reality was dangerously wide. The American advisory effort was also hampered by a lack of integration with the South Vietnamese political system. In Malaya, the British had worked through the state and district war executive committees, where police, military, and civilian officials sat together and made joint decisions. In Vietnam, the Americans tried to advise from the outside, without any equivalent structure. Corruption in Saigon was rampant. Officers sold supplies meant for their troops. The Americans provided money and weapons, but they could not provide the one thing that mattered most: a government that the people believed in. The French had lost because they fought a colonial war without popular support. The Americans were repeating the same mistake on a far larger scale. They had helicopters, napalm, and a fleet of bombers that the French could never have dreamed of. But the North Vietnamese had something that no amount of technology could overcome: a cause that their soldiers were willing to die for, and a strategy that measured success in decades, not months. The Americans saw the war as a problem to be solved. The North Vietnamese saw it as a river that would eventually wear down any obstacle. Cross left Vietnam with an uneasy feeling. The sheer scale of American commitment was impressive, but he had seen enough jungle warfare to know that firepower alone could not win. The enemy had to be separated from the people. The government had to offer something better than the insurgency. None of these things were happening in Vietnam. The French had already written their epitaph at Dien Bien Phu. The Americans were now beginning to write theirs: one helicopter sortie, one bombing run, one body bag at a time. The year is 1963. The place is Borneo, the world's third largest island, a sprawl of dense mountain rainforest and winding rivers that had barely been mapped. Britain still held the northern territories of Sarawak, Sabah, and Brunei, and the plan was to merge them with Malaya and Singapore into a new nation called Malaysia. Across the southern border, in Indonesian Kalimantan, President Sukarno had other ideas. Sukarno wanted to carve out a rival superpower called Mafilindo, uniting Malaya, the Philippines, and Indonesia under his sway. When Malaysia was formally declared in September 1963, he did not send diplomats, he sent soldiers. The British called it confrontation, and it was a different kind of jungle war, fought not against communist insurgents, but against the regular army of a neighbouring state. The border between British and Dutch Borneo had never been properly surveyed. It was a cartographer's afterthought, a dotted line on a map that meant nothing to the native tribes who lived on both sides. The Ibans, the Kayans, the Kelabits, they had traded and intermarried across that invisible boundary for centuries. Now it became a front line. The British response was overseen by Major General Walter Walker, the same officer who had founded the Jungle Warfare School during the Malayan emergency. He laid down 5 ingredients for success: unified operations, timely intelligence, speed and mobility, base security, and domination of the jungle. It was a recipe forged in Malaya, but Borneo would test it to its limits. The first deep incursion came in August 1963, when 60 Indonesian raiders crossed the border into the 3rd Division of Sarawak. Their target was the riverine town of Song. They had been launched without maps, compasses, or rations, a sign that Indonesian planning was as shaky as their strategic ambitions. The local population did not rise to join them. Then came the attack on Long Joey. On the night of September 27, 1963, a force of Indonesian regulars crossed the border and struck a village deep inside Sarawak. The place was defended by a detachment of border scouts, native auxiliaries recruited from the local tribes, and commanded by a young Gurkha corporal from the 1st Battalion, 2nd Gurkha Rifles, a man named Tej Bahadur Gurung. The border scouts were not trained for a pitched battle. They had been raised as eyes and ears, light reconnaissance men who knew the ground and the people. But the Indonesians came with mortars and machine guns, and they came in strength. The scouts, hopelessly outgunned, began to slip away into the dark. The Indonesians seized them, tied them up, and murdered most of them. 3 British officers who had been inspecting the village defences barely escaped with their lives. The wounded were hidden in the jungle with a promise of rescue. Corporal Teb Bahadur Gurung and his surviving men, carrying 2 wounded comrades, marched for 4 days without food to reach the administrative centre at Belaga. It was a defeat, and it stung. But defeat has a way of sharpening the mind. The Gurkha battalion commanding that sector did not wait for orders. A platoon was lifted by helicopter to a flank of the escape route, and an ambush was laid on the river. As the Indonesian raiders rowed back upstream in 2 boats, confident that their work was done, the Gurkhas opened fire in the dusk. All 26 Indonesians were killed, their boats drifted away in the current, carrying their weapons and their dead into the darkness. Longjawi was a turning point. It hardened British resolve and changed the posture from passive defense to active pursuit. The helicopter became the backbone of the campaign, not for mass assault, but for rapid insertion and resupply across a territory the size of England and Scotland combined. Yet there were never enough of them. Fewer than 60 troop-carrying helicopters were available for the entire theatre, and the cry went up for more. The last hours of 1963 brought another shock, this time in Sabah, at a logging camp near the town of Kalabakan. A platoon of the Royal Malay Regiment was stationed there in a base that had no defences, no alarm scheme, and sentries who had grown careless. On the night of December 31st, 35 Indonesian soldiers attacked. They caught the Malays asleep. The slaughter was swift. The Malay commander offered a pathetic excuse. He blamed the British for not supplying camp protection. It was a transparent evasion of his own failure, and it revealed a deeper rot. The rapid expansion of the Malaysian military after independence had produced officers who were over-promoted and undertrained. Courage alone could not compensate for slovenly discipline. The battalion sent to stabilize the area was the 1st Battalion, 10th Gurkha Rifles. The commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Bunny Burnett, arrived to find chaos and almost no usable intelligence. The only clues were a raided provision shop and the remains of cooked chickens found upriver. Burnett made a single deduction: the raiders would come looking for food again soon. The Gurkhas hunted them through a maze of tidal creeks, mangrove swamps, and partially logged jungle. Helicopters shifted blocking groups ahead of the enemy, while boats threaded the narrow waterways. By the end of January, the battalion had killed 20 Indonesians, captured 13, and accepted the surrender of 13 more. It was a brutal, clinical campaign of pursuit and annihilation. Yet the Malaysian forces remained a weak link. Cross met a Royal Malay Regiment commanding officer who had devised a unique defensive tactic. On being attacked, his men were to pour a sack of rice onto the ground so the hungry Indonesians would stop to eat it instead of killing them. The Malay soldiers would then judge whether the attackers were friendly enough to share a meal. Cross could barely believe what he was hearing. By 1965, the British had shifted to cross-border operations, code-named Claret. These were raids conducted secretly into Kalimantan, strictly controlled by the highest political authority. The troops could advance only as far as their supporting artillery could reach from gun positions just inside friendly territory. Helicopters were not allowed to cross the border, except in extreme emergencies, and every wounded man had to be carried back by hand. It was during one of these Claret operations that a young Gurkha lance corporal performed an act of heroism that would earn him the Victoria Cross. His name was Rambahadur Limbu, and he served with the 2nd Battalion, 10th Gurkha Rifles. The target was a ridge deep inside Kalimantan, where the Indonesians were building a camp. The approach was made over 3 days, crawling through secondary jungle so thick that tunnels had to be cut with machetes. The objective was a hill with sheer sides and only 3 narrow ridges leading up to it. The Indonesians had built 2 barriers of felled trees and sharpened stakes to block those ridges. The Gurkhas lost the element of surprise below the 2nd barrier. An immediate charge went in uphill. In the first minutes, 2 men of Limbu's fire group fell wounded in the open, exposed to aimed automatic fire from the enemy position. Rambahadur Limbu went forward alone. He dragged the first man to cover, then crawled back for the second. He was continuously exposed, firing as he moved, the enemy rounds cutting the air around him. Somehow he was not hit. He cleared the enemy from the crest with grenades and rifle fire, and his example inspired the rest of the platoon to push through. The official citation described his actions as reaching a zenith of premeditated valor. It was the first Victoria Cross won by a Gurkha since the Second World War, and it was awarded not for a defensive stand but for a deliberate, carefully planned attack across an international border. The pinnacle of tactical mastery came in March 1966, when Major C.J. Pike led a company of the 1st Battalion 10th Gurkha Rifles into Kalimantan on a reconnaissance. He had 10 days of rations and a cold, steady nerve. For 3 days, his men crawled through swamp and fern to observe a river used by the Indonesians to resupply their forward positions. Pike saw his chance. He laid 3 platoons in ambush positions along the riverbank, the men tunneling into the undergrowth so thoroughly that not a single footprint was left on the approach. They waited. On the second day, a landing craft packed with 35 Indonesian soldiers came downstream into the killing zone. The Gurkhas opened fire at 10 yards. The machine gunner emptied a 200-round belt into the boat at point-blank range, reloaded, and continued firing from the hip as he ran along the bank. Energa anti-tank grenades struck the hull. The boat heeled over and drifted away in silence. The Gurkhas waited 4 more hours. Just after 5 in the evening, 2 more boats appeared, one towing the other, carrying 9 men. The second ambush party finished them at 20 yards. When the action was over, 37 Indonesian soldiers lay dead. The Gurkhas had not a single casualty. It was the highest number of enemy killed in any single action of the entire confrontation. And it was achieved through meticulous planning, painstaking reconnaissance, and the ability of every man in the company to act instantly and correctly without needing an order. By mid-1966, the confrontation was winding down. A failed communist coup in Indonesia had crippled Sukarno's regime, and a new government in Jakarta was ready to talk peace. But there were still loose ends. An Indonesian lieutenant named Sumbi, a graduate of the British Jungle Warfare School, had boasted that he would lead 50 men across the border to sabotage the oil installations in Brunei. The Gurkha Para Company was tasked with stopping him. They had been operating in the high, cold jungle between the Sarawak border and the Brunei oil fields, living in 5-man patrols that stayed out for weeks at a time. On the morning of a routine patrol, a rifleman named Dharmalal Rai, who had served with Cross in Malaya, noticed something glinting in the undergrowth. It was a small piece of tinfoil, the kind that wrapped field rations. Dharmalal sniffed it. It smelled of coffee, and coffee was not issued to Gurkha patrols. He cast around and found footprints, 2 pairs of British pattern jungle boots heading north. He and his patrol commander tracked those prints for 3 days through cold rain and thick forest, never lighting a fire, never cooking a meal, sleeping in the open. On the 3rd day, they found where the footprints had doubled back and collected 48 more pairs. The main force had been walking on wrappings to hide their tracks, a trick Sumbi had learned on his jungle warfare course. Dharmalal had outsmarted him. The patrol reported back, and the hunt was on. By the time the confrontation officially ended in August 1966, almost all of Sumbi's men had been accounted for. The last 4 were tracked to a ridge on the Brunei border. A Gurkha patrol found a single leaf with an unnatural straight crease, a leaf that a nervous man had picked and folded while waiting. They knew the enemy was near. The 4 Indonesians were captured alive by Brunei troops, and one of them admitted that he had a habit of folding leaves and throwing them away. It was the smallest of clues, and it was enough. Confrontation cost the Commonwealth forces 114 dead and 118 wounded. The Indonesians lost at least 590 killed, 222 wounded, and 771 captured. In the House of Commons, the Secretary of State for Defense called it one of the most efficient uses of military force in the history of the world. The Gurkhas had shown that in jungle warfare, patience, discipline, and attention to the smallest detail could defeat an enemy who seemed to have every advantage. The year is 1964. The United States had begun its direct military escalation in South Vietnam. American advisors were now combatants, and the first bombing campaigns against the North were being planned. The shadow of the French defeat still hung over the region. But the Americans were determined not to repeat the mistakes of their predecessors. They brought an overwhelming arsenal of machinery and firepower to the jungle. General Giap had not been idle since Dien Bien Phu. He studied the American way of war with the same cold patience he had once reserved for the French. He knew that the United States could never be beaten on a conventional battlefield, not in the open. So he would fight a different war, a war of attrition and politics. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was already a lifeline, winding through Laos and Cambodia, immune to bombing. By 1965, American ground troops were arriving in force. The Marines landed at Da Nang, and the Army's 1st Cavalry Division deployed with its helicopters. The commanders believed that mobility and firepower would overwhelm the Viet Cong. They did not understand that the enemy measured time in decades, not in months. Every bombing pause allowed the North to rebuild. Every escalation only deepened the commitment. The jungle was not the enemy's obstacle, but his ally. He used tunnels, underground hospitals, and supply caches that were nearly invisible from the air. The American soldiers, many of them conscripts, were thrown into a world where no front line existed. They could be killed from any direction at any moment. The fear was constant, and it wore men down. The Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese regulars were masters of camouflage and patience. They would dig in for days, waiting for a column to pass. They used booby traps with a savage ingenuity that demoralized the American troops. A tripwire could mean a leg blown off. A seemingly innocent village could hide an entire battalion. The war was a nightmare of uncertainty. The Americans tried every technological gadget. They used defoliants to strip the jungle bare and sensors to detect movement. They flew people sniffers over the canopy, trying to find the enemy by the smell of urine. But the machines could not tell friend from foe, and they could not win the loyalty of the people. The political base in Saigon was rotten with corruption. In January 1968, the Tet Offensive began. It was the year of the monkey, and the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong launched attacks on more than 100 cities. They struck at the heart of the American effort, even penetrating the grounds of the American embassy in Saigon. The fighting in the ancient city of Hue lasted for 26 days and was savage beyond anything the Americans had seen. The battle for Hue was fought house by house, block by block. The Marines and Arvin soldiers had to root out the enemy from fortified bunkers and tunnels. They used flamethrowers and demolition charges. It was a bloody, grinding fight. The North Vietnamese had planned meticulously, and their soldiers were prepared to die to the last man. Militarily, the Tet Offensive was a disaster for the Communists. They suffered enormous casualties and never regained the same strength in the South. But politically, it was a knockout blow. The American public, who had been told the war was being won, saw the violence unfolding in their living rooms. The news reports were graphic and raw. Trust in the government evaporated. The Viet Cong tunnel system maps, captured in earlier years, had shown how deep the enemy was embedded, but even that intelligence could not prepare the American people for the shock of Tet. The war had come to the cities, and it looked like a defeat. The military had not lost the battle, but the home front had. It was a turning point from which the United States never recovered. After Tet, the American strategy shifted. President Johnson announced a bombing halt and began peace talks. The troops were not withdrawn, but the momentum was gone. The South Vietnamese army was expected to take over the fighting. It was called Vietnamization, but it was a slow and painful process. The corruption and incompetence of the RVN had not been cured. The war dragged on for another 7 years. The Americans continued to pour in resources, but the will to win had vanished. The North Vietnamese used the bombing pauses to rebuild their supply lines. They knew that time was on their side. The United States was fighting a clock that ticked in election cycles, not in generations. In 1972, after the Easter Offensive, the peace negotiations in Paris dragged on. The American bombing of Hanoi and Haiphong was intense, but it did not break the North's resolve. Meanwhile, in Laos, the war was being fought in the shadows. The Royal Lao Army was little more than a collection of soldiers who sold their American-supplied weapons to the enemy. It was in this demoralized landscape that John Cross arrived as the British Defense Attaché. He had spent years in the jungles of Malaya and Borneo, learning the art of unconventional war. Now he was seeing the other side of the coin, a war that was being lost not in the jungle, but in the souls of the men who were supposed to fight it. Cross visited a Royal Lao Army detachment at a strategic road junction. There was a medium artillery piece aimed toward the enemy, perfectly camouflaged. The colonel in command was proud of his gun. But when Cross asked when it had last fired, the answer was that it had been unserviceable for months. The colonel did not want to disturb the camouflage because the enemy might see it and attack. Another officer in the south told Cross the truth. Most of the supplies given to the Royal Lao Army were sold to the Pathet Lao, who handed them to the North Vietnamese. Nobody wanted to give up the chance to make money. The war had become a business, and the communists were the best customers. It was a corruption so deep that no amount of American aid could repair it. In Cambodia, the same story was repeated. President Lon Nol's generals were selling artillery shells and ammunition to the Khmer Rouge. The United States dropped thousands of tons of bombs on the country, trying to destroy communist sanctuaries. But the bombing only drove the peasants into the arms of the revolutionaries. The Khmer Rouge grew stronger with every passing year. By early 1975, the end was near. The North Vietnamese launched a massive conventional offensive, rolling through the Central Highlands towards Saigon. The ARVN collapsed. Soldiers threw away their uniforms and tried to escape. The American advisors were evacuated in panic. Cross, who had sparred with the very reporters whose sensationalism triggered the refugee crisis years before, saw his warnings vindicated in the final chaos. The long war had come down to a final desperate rush for the exits. The fall of Saigon on April 30, 1975, brought 30 years of war to a close. North Vietnamese tanks rolled through the gates of the presidential palace, a moment of finality that the opening scene had already captured. The helicopters on the embassy roof were the last image of an American war that had exhausted itself. The cost was staggering: 58,000 American dead, over 1 million Vietnamese, and a nation torn apart. The North Vietnamese had demonstrated that patience and political will could outlast any military power. The river, as Cross had come to understand, had worn down the stone. The fall of Saigon did not mean the end of the war in Indochina. In Laos, the Pathet Lao were already moving to take full control. The king was deposed, and a communist regime was installed. The North Vietnamese troops who had fought alongside them stayed to ensure loyalty. The country slid into isolation and poverty. Cross was still in Vientiane as the last British defense attaché when the communists took over. He saw the new masters emerge from the jungle, men who had spent years in hiding. They were disciplined and ideologically pure. They had no time for the old ways of the Royal Lao Army. The city changed overnight, becoming quiet and fearful. He debriefed a surrendered Pathet Lao officer who told him how the war had been won. It was not just about soldiers and guns, it was about the support of the people. The communists had offered a vision of independence and justice, however brutal. The Americans had offered only bombs and a corrupt government. The choice for many had been simple. In Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge marched into Phnom Penh in April 1975. They declared Year Zero and began a radical revolution. The cities were emptied, the currency abolished, and anyone suspected of being an intellectual was executed. The killing fields soon became a genocide. The war that had rained bombs on the countryside had produced a monstrous harvest. The Vietnamese communists, having won their own war, turned on their former Khmer Rouge allies. But that was a later chapter. In 1976, the entire region was in communist hands. The dominoes had fallen, just as the American strategists had feared. But the fall had come not from military defeat on the battlefield, but from political failure and the loss of legitimacy. The tunnel system maps that had been captured years before now seemed like relics of a bygone war. The Viet Cong infrastructure had been dismantled by the North Vietnamese regulars, who took over the fight in the final years. The revolution had consumed its own children. The dream of a unified, independent Vietnam had been achieved, but at a terrible cost. Cross could not help but compare this outcome to the wars he had known in Malaya and Borneo. The British had succeeded by winning the hearts and minds of the people. They had given Malaya independence and built a political structure that could stand against the communist threat. In Indochina, the French and Americans had failed to offer anything that the people wanted more than freedom. The sanctuary problem had been the key. The British had denied it to the Indonesian enemy by crossing the border in Borneo. In Vietnam, the Ho Chi Minh Trail had never been closed, and the bombing of Cambodia had only radicalized the population. The Americans had never been willing to pay the political price of truly invading the North or sealing the borders. The war in Indochina was a tragedy of misapplied power. The Americans had the technology, the money, and the bravery of individual soldiers, but they lacked the patience to win a war that was political at its core. They applied military force where only political change could work. And when the Soviet Union supplied the North Vietnamese with the weapons they needed, the global dimension of the conflict was confirmed. By the end of 1976, the killing fields of Cambodia had begun in earnest. The Khmer Rouge executed hundreds of thousands. The American intervention, which had started with such high hopes, had ended in a catastrophe that would haunt the nation for decades. The jungles of Indochina had claimed their victory, not by defeating the enemy in battle, but by outlasting him. Giap, who had orchestrated that victory, lived to see the unification of Vietnam and died in 2013 at the age of 102. In Malaya, the war had ended differently. Templer returned to Britain in 1954, later serving as chief of the Imperial General Staff. His hearts and minds strategy became a model for counterinsurgency worldwide. Chin Peng remained in the jungle until 1989, when a peace agreement formally ended the communist insurgency in Malaya, though his cause had already been defeated years before. Lieutenant Colonel Jarvis completed his tour in Indochina and retired from the army in the early 1950s. Major Richardson later rose to command his battalion, and his unintended victory at Johor remained a textbook example of aggressive patrolling. Lance Corporal Rambahadur Limbu survived the war and returned to a quiet life in Nepal, where he was celebrated as one of the last Gurkha recipients of the Victoria Cross. Major C.J. Pike continued his career in the Gurkha Brigade, eventually retiring as a lieutenant colonel, and his operational methods became part of the official jungle warfare curriculum. Lieutenant Sumbi was among those captured. His own training turned against him, and the Brunei oil fields remained untouched, and the Russian agent disappeared into the Soviet system, a forgotten witness to the long war that was only beginning. By 1977, the jungles of Southeast Asia had fallen silent. The wars were over. The communists had won in Indochina. The British had won in Malaya and Borneo. But for the men who had fought in those green shadows, the lessons were not forgotten. John Cross, now retired in Nepal, spent his final years distilling what he had learned. He knew that the jungle was not just a place of trees and mud. It was a demanding environment that stripped away every pretense. A soldier's survival depended on patience, silence, and the ability to read the smallest signs. Cross had written down the rules of movement in the jungle, and they were simple. Never cut what you could break naturally, never break what you could bend, never bend what you could move. Tread in water to hide your tracks. Step over obstacles rather than on them. The aim was to leave no mark. A single unbroken leaf could betray a patrol. Nature abhorred straight lines, so a folded leaf or a bent twig was a flag to a trained eye. These were not textbook theories. They were earned in sweat and fear. Tracking was the art of reading the jungle floor. A patch of mud on a dry root, a scuffed tree bole with sap oozing, a broken spider web, all told a story. The best trackers could tell how long ago a man had passed by the color of a cut. Cross had seen Gurkhas pick up a trail that was invisible to others. He recalled the lesson of the folded leaf that had led to the last 4 men of Sumbi's gang. That kind of skill came from living in the jungle, not just visiting it. The Gurkha soldiers had learned it as boys in the Nepali hills. Mental discipline was the hardest skill of all. Fear could make a man freeze or fire wildly. Patience was the antidote. Cross had learned to wait for hours, motionless, listening. The jungle was full of noises, birds, insects, the rustle of leaves. But a man moving made a different sound. A muttered voice carried through the undergrowth. In one grueling instance, a company waited 25 days in a swamp for an ambush that killed 3 guerrillas on the final day of endurance. That was not luck. That was a refusal to break. Cross kept a compass and a worn jungle hat in his study. The compass was simple, a liquid-filled dial, no batteries. The hat was faded green, stained with sweat. They reminded him that technology was a tool, not a replacement for human skill. In the jungle, a broken radio meant silence. A lost bearing meant death. The men who survived were those who carried the knowledge in their bones, not in a manual. The hat had seen decades of rain and sun. It was a silent witness to the patience that the jungle demanded. By the turn of the century, the world had changed. Satellites watched from above. Drones flew over deserts. Night vision turned darkness into day. Yet the same old wars continued. In Nepal, Maoist insurgents took to the forests in the 1990s. In the Philippines, The New People's Army used the jungle as a base. In Africa, diamond smugglers and poachers moved through thick bush. The terrain had not changed, and neither had the principles of fighting in it. His experiences had warned him that the West often defeated itself by not knowing its own strengths. Cross watched the news from his home in the hills. He saw American soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan, struggling in complex terrain. He read about the French in Mali, hunting jihadists in the Sahel. The same mistakes were being repeated. Armies equipped with billions of dollars in hardware were tied down by small groups of determined men who knew the ground. The Western desire for quick victory clashed with the reality of a patient enemy. The problem was not a lack of technology. It was a lack of patience. In Malaya, the British had taken 12 years to defeat a few thousand guerrillas, but they had done it by winning over the people, not by bombing them. In Vietnam, the Americans had measured time in election cycles. The enemy measured it in generations. Cross had seen it firsthand in Laos, the artillery piece that could not be fired because the colonel feared disturbing the camouflage. The war had already been lost in the minds of the men who were supposed to fight it. His final writings were not a history lesson. They were a manual for the next generation of soldiers who would face the same green shadows. The future, Cross wrote, would bring new enemies. Religion had replaced politics as a cause. The jungles of the Philippines, the forests of Colombia, the bamboo thickets of Nepal, all would see fighting. The answer was not more machines. It was the human heart. A soldier who understood why he was fighting, who believed in his cause, could endure anything. The communists had known that. The Gurkhas had known it too. The Western armies Cross feared had forgotten it. Caucasian impatience, he called it. The urge to fix a problem quickly, without understanding its roots. The final lesson, Cross wrote, was a simple warning. The lessons of the jungle were not just for soldiers in green uniforms. They were for anyone who had to survive in a hostile world. Patience, silence, attention to detail. Those were the tools that won wars. The compass and the hat sat on his desk as he wrote. They were reminders that the most important battles are not fought with machines. They are fought in the human mind. And in the end, the river wears down the stone. If you have your own memories of service in the jungles of Southeast Asia, or stories passed down from family who served in Malaya or Borneo or Vietnam, we would love to hear them in the comments below. We read everyone. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to see more history that digs beneath the surface, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. It helps us keep telling these forgotten stories. Thank you for listening and for keeping history alive.